I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Richard Deming, whose book, Art of the Ordinary, The Everyday Domain of Art, Film, Philosophy, and Poetry, will probably, at the very least, make you think twice about the things that you are doing on an everyday basis that often go unremarked, and that's basically what the book is about, I would say. Thinking more clearly, or at least questioning the things that we do every single day. So I'm very excited to be speaking with Richard Deming today. I will just remind people that if you want to help support this podcast, you can leave a review on any of the major social media, and if you want to impress your friends and be the coolest person on your block, grab some stickers. They're available online and they help support this podcast, and I really appreciate the people who have been sending orders in. You know, I'm fulfilling them personally, and all of that money goes to buying new books that I can read and then ask the author to speak about on the podcast. That said, Richard, thank you so much for being on. Let's get right into it, and I want to ask you about Stephen Wright, the comedian, and your comparison of him to Heraclitus. So you're taking people thousands of years apart and in different domains. I mean, one would be standard reading in a philosophy class, and one in many students' careers may never show up in university or college. How are you putting them together, and what made you decide to do that?
Well, Stephen Wright is just a master of the one-liner and really a surrealist one-liner. I found a few times earlier on that when I would want to make a point about paradox, that Stephen Wright was someone that I would gravitate towards. And I thought, what happens if you put a certain amount of weight on those one-liners? What do they reveal about how language works, or the proximity or distance between his sort of surreal version of things and our ordinary understanding of things? But also it's this point of connection in which they both torque language, really, to make it not obscure, but to really create moments where attention is kind of demanded. I mean, that's why listening to Stephen Wright, there can be a moment of a lag in which people process what he said, and then the laugh comes.
Yeah.
I was interested in the mystery that that's built on, and seeing what we could get from that. But also really the idea that they both had, that the most mysterious thing to us is that which is really all around us.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone who doesn't know Stephen Wright, or probably they do know, but they can't put the face and the name together, is there any maybe favorite one-liner of yours that you could say? Maybe you could describe him a little bit for people?
Well, I can give you the heart of the whole book is really this, I think, really great moment of his, in which he says roughly, someone broke in the other day and stole everything I own and replaced it with an exact replica. I called my friend and said, hey, someone broke in, stole everything I own, replaced it with an exact replica. What do you think? And he said, do I know you? And that to me was just the sort of the essence of the uncanny. And that's what I wanted to really think about, because I think that's not, it's funny and it's weird, but why is it funny was interesting to me. And I think that is a really great encapsulation of a feeling of alienation, but not alienation from everything that you should know, everything that should be yours, everything that should connect you to yourself. The estrangement is located kind of within and within one's own perception. So I thought, wow, this is something that I just feel is funny, but also there's something philosophically to it and psychologically to it that I wanted to explore.
It makes a lot of sense, especially it's interesting that, like I said, I looked up clips of his afterward. I realized I was sort of familiar with him, but I didn't get the name right away. They're literally like an hour-long list of clips that you can easily find with just sort of one-liners that are, I would say, equally funny as that. One of my favorites was My friend sent me a postcard with the picture of the world from space and said, "I wish you were here." And,
Yeah.
and that, yeah, to me also kind of embodies what you're doing in the book, which is to a certain extent making the everyday strange so that we can observe it. What is the connection then to Heraclitus?
Well, Heraclitus also, believed that that which is all around us is that which is most deeply mysterious because we can't get near it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that what Heraclitus does, and this is, a lot of people's reading, not everybody's, but a lot of people's reading, is that he used these aphorisms that created kind of conceptual paradoxes to create these acts of attention so that we would be called to pay attention to our own acts of perception and, or less grandiosely, just the very elements of our own life. If you think of, say, Heraclitus saying the way up is the same as the way down, that sounds to me kind of close to something that Stephen Wright could have said and is paradoxical and, for me, poetic in that way, in that it's not something that it doesn't give us information. It doesn't actually even express something so much as enact a particular position, and that we have to then try to, to use the contemporary vernacular, unpack it or think through the implications of what that might mean if we take a line like that seriously.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you then about how you chose to write this book, because you're dealing, at least especially in that chapter, with these kinds of aphorisms or one-liners, but your book itself does not sound like an aphorism or one-liner. In fact, I would say it sounds almost like prose writing. And knowing that you're directing the creative writing program, I would assume that you've thought a lot about how, not just the arguments that you're going to make, but how you want that to sound. How did you decide to write it in this way, and what, if anything, were you thinking about in terms of how you wanted your book to sound?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's a difficult situation ultimately to get into in a bit about discourse, about philosophical discourse, and academic discourse. I knew that the intellectual figure that looms largest for me is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Mm-hmm. And there's a challenge in thinking about, writing about Emerson. He's not the only figure that this is true, but I think in some ways he's the most paradoxical, that if you write in a kind of clinical, objective way, that you are not being sufficiently Emersonian. Mm-hmm. What Emerson really wanted to create were the conditions in which someone acts rather than reacts, that they think with the wildness of the mind, and that it's not simply a collaging of different ready-made thoughts and positions. I wanted to write kind of from that place as much as I could, and to be, open enough that I would not simply be telling readers things, but, trying to also have an evocative style that would get people to think about what I just said and to sort of think through how I said it. Because I think it's really impossible at a certain level to separate form and content. At the very least, what I'm interested in is self-consciousness, giving us moments where we are conscious of ourselves as selves. And so that the writing has to do that at some level. I have to do it as the writer, and I want to make those conditions available to the reader as well.
Yeah, and I found, I don't know what it was exactly, but there was something that stood out in reading this as opposed to somewhat similar books, like maybe, for example, Desserteau and Bourdieu and others, that separated or distinguish it, but I wasn't sure exactly what. And I'm wondering, as you're writing, are you sort of in a state of flow where you're going from ideas to ideas, or are you purposefully sort of arranging things so that maybe people do pause? Because I mean, maybe it was just me, but I found myself sort of pausing when you said or when you wrote certain things, and then having to, if not go back to it, then at least, take a moment to think about, sort of like these one-liners, right? Where you hear it, it makes sense, but then after another second or two, you realize how strange some of these things are that we take for granted, like with the comedians. So I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more about how you wrote and how you envisioned the reader interpreting that.
I think that a lot of it is, for me in the writing, wanting to challenge and surprise myself. And so I want to push a thought as far as I can get it to go, because I really do believe in the force of an aphorism. The aphorism is an interesting construct because they don't arrive of an argument. Like, you don't get syllogistically to an aphorism. Mm-hmm. An aphorism simply, but not merely, feels true. It feels right, which I think is often how poems work as well. And so I wanted to get to a place where what I was saying felt right. And then we can ask, well, why does that feel right? The way I experienced that line from Stephen Wright, for instance. Mm-hmm. Then there's opportunity to go back, but I wanted it to have that. And I don't necessarily think, this will get them. Though I'm really pleased to hear that you did, that you talking about your experience stopping and reading it again. I mean, I don't think that that's a kind of wanting to be obscure. I think that that's just the nature of wanting us to pay attention to language and how we use it. So that if that's the case, then I want to use language that more or less every word is sort of exploding with meaning and possibility, because ultimately that's the premise of what I'm doing, that everything has that potential for an excess of meaning.
Yeah, and then maybe you can say a little bit about what is the art of the ordinary, because I was sort of happy early on reading the introduction, I think it is, where you say this book, something to the effect of, this book isn't merely about how everything is art and so everything is sort of magical. It's sort of the opposite, where everything can be seen from an ordinary perspective, but that we shouldn't take that for granted. And again, I mean, you say it better than I do in a paraphrase, but maybe you could say a little bit more about what the art of the ordinary is.
Yeah, well, I wanted to, the difficulty, the paradox is sort of, I make a lot out of a phrase that Fairfield Porter gave us, which is a usable paradox. Mm-hmm. And I think that, that's really the essence of the ordinary, because if you talk about the ordinary or the everyday in the sort of phenomenological terms that I'm thinking of, then you bring attention to it, and then you risk estranging it from its ordinariness, and then it's not ordinary anymore. And that can either make it uncanny or it can make it, miraculous, transcendent. So then what I got interested in was looking at how people represent the ordinary, and they, in art or philosophy or film or poetry, and in that way, they provide a kind of response that we can then respond to. So there's really layers of responses to the ordinary. It's like a black hole. You can't quite look at it. You can't quite see it. You can see its effects on the things around it. And so that's what I wanted to see, how people tried to encounter the ordinary through their art or their philosophy, their thinking, whatever form that takes. And that's then the thing that we can respond to. And actually what happens is that those can model ways of responding to the ordinary, while also giving us ways of thinking of how others respond to the ordinary. I don't think that was very clear. Was that clear?
Well, I think it's sort of like the ordinary, where it seems clear, but then the more you think about it, the more unclear it gets, which I guess is like a lot of the topics in philosophy.
Yeah, it's probably how my teaching goes too. But.
Even if that's true, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, sort of what you point out is that we shouldn't take this stuff for granted as if it were simple, because it's not so simple. We act as if it were simple, but then that misses a bunch of stuff. I'm curious then also, you talk about a lecture in which, I can't remember his name now, I'm sure you can say, the author asks, What Is It Like to Lead a Life?
Oh, Richard Wollheim. Uh-huh.
Yeah, Walheim. In writing this or in thinking through the subjects that you do, has that answer, in your mind at least, changed at all in terms of what is it like to lead a life? Have you elaborated that in some way in your own life by thinking through the ordinary?
Yeah, that's really interesting and a challenging question, Chris. I think that there's a refinement that happens, or maybe it's better to say an amplification. It really becomes an unsettling. And I think that in the best sense, because I think that if I got to the end of writing about these things and I thought, wow, now I have all the answers. Well, that's done. What's next? That would not be to me a really useful act of thinking. Nothing really is that settled. I mean, I think that what thinking does at its best is unsettle, which is something that was that's an Emersonian ideal, that it unsettles all things, and that what I am really, committed to is the idea that the very moment that if I were to say that this is now, I figured this out, or I have a deep understanding of my life, that's where it goes dark again. That's why you don't really get to the end of psychoanalysis, and you don't get to the end of philosophy, because this is something that Emerson says that is really probably a central credo of my life, which is, this one fact the world hates, that the soul becomes. That means that every activity is adding to that store of experiences and, possibly knowledge or blindness that is myself. What I might say that I got to was a sense of how there's so much more to look at, and that it can almost be overwhelming in that way. But I think, someone like Walt Whitman, who at the beginning of Song of Myself, basically he pulls up this blade of grass and looks at it and then spins out these 52 cantos, pages and pages. And he's just looking at one blade of grass. And he's like, well, what if I considered the entire, acre? What if I considered everything? That possibility for really going into one thing and penetrating it is great. And maybe you'll come to the end, but then there's the thing next to it. That sense of continually opening out, and that the thing I miss most is the act of writing, of trying to get this stuff into language.
Yeah, and it seems like a very Heraclitus style idea that we are always becoming, and there isn't this one final thing that we can say that we are.
Yeah, there's a way that starts to sound romantic or suspiciously transcendental. But I think at the same time that there is simply a reality to it, that if, Chris, we were to talk a year from now and we were talking about our lives, that we would both be a year older, and there would have been experiences that would have either, consciously or unconsciously changed us. Our bodies would be a year older, and there would be something different in being that age that neither you or I have ever been before. And so we're constantly accruing these kinds of experiences and adding them to our understanding of how things work. And so that, where am I most authentically myself? When I was 15, when I was 25, when I was 35? Will it be when I'm 78? Or will it be just on my deathbed when there's nothing more that can come in while I'm still conscious? And so none of these are a quote unquote authentic thing. It's like reading a book. Another Emersonian sort of trope is that you can't say this is the entire book on page 72. You have to read the entire book, and then you have the written life. And then you don't even really have time to understand it, because as soon as that life ends, you're outside it. And then you can't, whether you believe in an afterlife or not, you're no longer part of that life. So that idea of the soul becoming, I mean, you can put the soul in quotes and just say, okay, I'm uncomfortable with a kind of religious or theological idea of soul, and I'll just read that as subjectivity. And I think that you're still in that same position.
Yeah, well, actually, that is a nice connection to the next question I wanted to ask, which is writing the book, reading the book, and maybe sort of the book itself as an object. Is it ordinary itself, or is reading and thinking about this in your mind somewhat outside of the ordinary?
Well, it's both inside and outside. I mean, it's something that we do all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Your beloved can hand you a list and it says bread, milk, that's reading. But I think that, it goes back to your question about style. It's becoming conscious of this, doing this as an experience. And that leads to that, I think, interesting possibility of self-consciousness as the experience of experience. So we're experiencing things all the time, most of which we filter out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about your questions and I'm thinking about the answers. Also at the same time, it's pretty chilly here, relatively chilly. It's lower 40s. And so the heat is on. I can hear the heat coming on in the vents. And outside the window is a maple tree that still has its red leaves. Then I'm going to have to rake those. And so all of these things, plus all the art that's on my walls, that's sort of impacting me, and the smells. And I'm filtering all of that out and just thinking about your question. But at the same time, all of these things are making a claim on me that I'm not necessarily paying attention to, but is still happening. Not to mention, I'm also thinking about not only answering your question, but how to answer your question, and what is the language that I should use in this situation. And am I being too abstract? Am I being too meta in talking about this? So this is a layer of self-consciousness, which can be, for some people, it can be, annoying. And that's what they call postmodern. But at the same time, we are still making these choices. The language you and I are using right now, we're making conscious and unconscious choices about the words that we're going to use. And I think that if we are not simply talking, but being aware of ourselves making these decisions and then sort of consciously making them and saying, okay, I'm going to commit to this way of talking, then we are aware. And if we are aware, we have more agency. And if we have more agency, then we are, I think, closer to our humanity. If by humanity or the human, we mean something akin to that which has individual agency that it is responsible to and for, then I think that that's how reading activates a kind of ethical situation.
And I want to ask a little bit more about that in relation to what I said earlier about sort of having to pause sometimes when reading. I realize, and I think this is applicable to multiple works, or maybe all works in philosophy especially, the act of reading is one thing. The awareness of reading seems to prevent the act of reading. Like, in other words, you can't really think about what it means to read as you're reading, because then, at least for me, I'm not conscious of the words anymore. I'm conscious of trying to read or thinking about writing and stuff like that. And then, so at that point, I kind of have to go back. In that sense, your book obviously is quite different from a shopping list where I guess after reading your book, maybe anyone can think about shopping lists as the art of the ordinary and start to ask questions that they wouldn't normally. But generally speaking, if, you say that you need to buy bananas and you see that's on your list, I don't have to pause and think about that. Whereas if you, especially in some of the chapters, start to think about the act of becoming aware of the everyday or these seemingly mundane or quotidian aspects of our lives, it makes me think about something else, and therefore it's sort of, to me, outside of the ordinary. Does your book fit within the ordinary, or does it exist outside and force us to confront the ordinary, but from an outside perspective? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think it does that, or that's in part my hope, because part of the ordinary is that the blindness of it. How we do go into not thinking about it because it's so familiar. We don't need to pay attention to it. And, like these aphorists or, people have been talking about, it's a way of pausing it for a moment. Wollheim was interesting. He's not the only one to do it, but he would do this very interesting project, and he would stand in front of a painting and look at it for like an hour, which is really interesting because I've seen the numbers, and it's something like at a general museum, people pause in front of a painting for something like an average of 3 to 4 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And so that he would look for an hour at something, and just even that act of really paying attention to what he looked at and how it arrived at him, he slowed all of it down. And I think that, that's some of my hope, is to more or less hit for like watching a movie and pause on a frame and look at what's actually happening in the frame. Or think about, like, if you're teaching writing, I think of any kind, whether it's creative or academic, you sometimes say to a student, well, okay, what would happen if this sentence were all the same words were there, but instead of beginning with the subject, that you begin with a different kind of introductory phrase? What would the difference be in its effect on the reader? And so that's some of what I'm trying to do, is to set up these possibilities of slowing down, or, as you said earlier, estranging just enough so that we can pay attention to it. And you're right, there's a certain level of, one has to be utilitarian. You have to pay the parking ticket. You have to read where to take that money to pay for that parking ticket. You have to read the list, or you have to read the contract. But I think that our problem is not that we have to remind ourselves to be utilitarian. I think that most of the time, and probably increasingly, are in a situation where that sort of critical thinking, or that kind of attentive thinking, attending to our own attention, is actually what is lost. And so that's, anything that helps us think through the implications of the language that we're using, even if it's only sometimes, I think can work. And actually, I think that you can develop a certain amount of useful self-consciousness in a way that it doesn't slow down what you're thinking, but you are aware that, especially in important situations, that the language that you use is the language that you chose, and so you're responsible for its choices. So yeah, that's a long way of saying, I think that this isn't itself an act of the ordinary, and I'm probably very guilty of the language that I use in the book, and probably the language that I'm using now is not the language that we use in everyday life. But it's because the ordinary is, by its very nature, the thing that we can't get to. So just trying to figure out how to do it, I think, is a first and valuable step.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I was just thinking, as you were saying that, I think a lot of people who are studying philosophy or critical theory or anything related to that probably would already buy into that argument or that way of looking at the world, which, I do myself. I'm wondering, though, if you could say something to someone who might describe themselves as, a practical thinker or a utilitarian thinker, and therefore isn't convinced that we should pay attention to something like Art of the Ordinary. I imagine it's a certain group of people who see this and would be interested in it. For anyone who's maybe not, because chances are if they're not interested, they're not listening to this podcast, but maybe it can help. Maybe it can help those of us who are interested in these kinds of questions to talk to others who aren't, or who are maybe on the fence. Is there a certain value, or maybe you don't even want to phrase it like that, but what is the importance of this, which you've already started to say, but maybe you could say a little bit more about doing something that I think those outside philosophy could think is a waste of time?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point of encounter. Because, I think that the interesting point of encounter is that a deep belief that at its best, philosophy isn't simply a discourse. It's not simply a kind of academic discipline, but it's a way of trying to be aware of oneself and to know the world better and to know oneself better. It's not self-help, it's an attempt at self-knowing. To come at it from a personal anecdote, one of the things that kind of led me to philosophy and to poetry and to the arts was a general concern that I don't necessarily know what other people mean when they say something.
Mm-hmm.
So that if they say a word, I'm not always sure. There's a kind of anxiety that I don't know what they mean by that word. Arguably, this is all just an extension of that, a kind of amplification of my thinking through that anxiety to figure out where that point of contact between myself and somebody else might be, or myself and the world, and that you could come to the realization that if language or words that are important to you don't mean what you think they mean, then the world might not be what you think it is. And if the world is not what you think it is, it may not be the world. It may be that you are not who you think you are. And so all of it is a kind of trying to know how we use language and when to use it. It's a feeling a little bit like alienation. It's always a feeling like being not exactly a native speaker of your own language. Yeah, it's a dividing line, and the place to figure out who would pay attention is, do you want to know yourself better? Do you want to know the world better and your connection to it, or your connection to your own life? And that we could exclude all the words, we could bracket them off. I mean, all of that's really just to tune the language up enough so that it can be precise enough, that it can make distinctions. But ultimately, getting people to think about their relationship to the things that are around them and to their feelings, and that their subjective sense of being in the world. Yeah, these are all the things that I think are the stuff of what it means just to be someone living in the world.
It's funny, I just did an interview last week with Jesper Juhl, who's written this book, The Art of Failure, and he has basically this argument that people don't like failing. People know that playing games will lead to failure, and yet people play games. And so it's this paradox where we don't like failure, but we do these games where we know that there's a good chance we're going to fail. It seems like there's something going on here with The Ordinary. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'd be interested in seeing what you think. It seems like we like to feel stable, generally speaking, and we like to feel like we understand the world. We have an anxiety, or at least those of us who are probably reading this and listening to this, have an anxiety that we don't understand the world. And turning to this kind of thinking or philosophy or analysis almost guarantees us a decentering in which we feel less stable.
Uh-huh.
And yet we keep doing it. And so it's not exactly the same as failure, but it's this idea that we want to feel a little bit more stable maybe, or that we understand the world a little bit better. And we turn to philosophy, knowing that philosophy will make us more sort of unstable in the things that we take for granted, like the ordinary. Do you see it like that, or do you see it maybe in a different way?
Well, sometimes I see it like that. I mean, that's along the lines of what Cavell's reading of Emerson is, that there's a kind of moral perfectionism, that we get to the edge of a circle, Emerson says, and when we get there, we realize that another circle can be drawn around that circle. So again, that idea that we can't come to the end of anything, that can be really positive and liberating, because the world is bigger than you think it might be, and that means there's more possible things in it, and that is a constant opening. And I think that is the wanting to come to the end of what I can know, to find out what it is that is still out there. Through that you can grow. Mm-hmm. Through that you can keep expanding the world, instead of saying, like we were saying earlier, okay, I've gotten to the end of things and now I'm done, and I guess I don't have anything else I have to do. Well, that was easy. Mm-hmm. If you instead get to this place where you think it's bigger, and it is scary, but there's a kind of sublime to it that I think can be really positive. But I think that there's a kind of temperament in that. This is maybe a bad example, but you know that show, The Walking Dead? Mm-hmm. a couple seasons ago. It's when the big bad guy, Negan, he's finally introduced, and Rick and the band of zombie survivors are trying to drive somewhere in their VW. And wherever they go, Negan's guys show up and block the road. And so they're trapped, and they get out of the RV, and Negan makes them kneel in front of him, and he says to Rick, who's the leader, has been the leader for years of these people, and he says, "Hurts, doesn't it? That moment when you realize the world is bigger than you thought it was." And that is a horrifying moment. And this is the character that's supposed to really be in control and sort of saving everybody and getting them there because he could outthink everybody and had all the angles figured. And he realizes he had no sense of just how big the world was. And I think that there is that moment, and some people, don't want to come to that. But I think that there's a lot of that sense of searching that's why we have philosophy. That's why even we have, I think, theology, that there's a desire to want more than this. Or to know, my position is that this itself is virtually unknowable, certainly inexhaustible. Mm-hmm. And so that we don't have to create a larger metaphysics because we will not finish this. If the soul is always becoming, that means that it's growing and building. And I think that, to go back to, this is another movie and it's probably too obscure an example. But Jacob's Ladder came out in the late 80s. Spoiler alert. So Tim Robbins plays this. Do you know this movie, Chris?
I know of it, but I don't think I've seen it.
Oh, so basically there's this guy played by Tim Robbins who had been in Vietnam, and he's back home, and it's clear all of these sort of demons are coming to get him. And they're taking the people away in his life away, and it's really horrifying. And at the end of the movie, he realizes that they're angels, and they explain that they appear like demons because you're afraid of the change, of giving up the world that you have to step into whatever is next. And again, taking out the sort of theological like that I think is part of it. This is that moment where you can let go of holding on to things simply because you're afraid of change, and opening up to the possibility of change. So this is like a full circle of coming back to Heraclitus, mm-hmm. and coming back to Emerson, and this idea that everything is changing. There is nothing that does not change. Our very atoms are changing. In the time that we've spoken, we've lost cells, and everybody listening has lost cells. And so there's that change and greater changes as well. And you can deny it, and I hate to sound moralistic, but I think it's just simply almost ontological or epistemological that if that is always changing, then to be attentive to how we can expand rather than contract our lives, that seems to me a really positive and valuable thing.
Yeah, and I love your example of The Walking Dead because it highlights the point that you're trying to make, but it also, to me, demonstrates how I can just picture you watching The Walking Dead and thinking this to yourself, and then maybe potentially using that if not in a classroom, then maybe in a piece of writing or something like that. Which brings me to my question, which is, how do you choose what to think about and work on? Are you, for example, watching some late night comedy rerun and thinking this would be a perfect way to introduce sort of art of the ordinary, or at least an element of that? Or is there another way that you're choosing sort of what examples to use, but also what to think about? Like, does it come to you leading your everyday life, or is there some way in which you go looking for subjects and for examples of them?
It tends to be things that I don't understand, and I want to understand them. I began by saying I had read Cavell, I had used Cavell a lot, but I really wanted to just go deeper into his thinking about what the ordinary might be, just so I could so I could kind of internalize it and try it on. But a lot of it is also, I think, paying attention to where my attention goes. Once you kind of tune the dial to something, there's, this isn't really how the mind works, but there is a kind of filter that comes on, and you, or at least I, start to see examples or start to see where certain things work within that within that question, or how they might respond to that kind of question. There's a kind of almost like heliotropic that you say, well, this is the thing, or I say, this is the thing I'm asking. And then I look to see what sort of turns its face to that. And sometimes the most interesting things are not, or usually the most interesting things are not the ones that are obvious, but the things that are really less obvious, but somehow still fit or feel like they fit. And then you have to make that connection.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if you are planning to maybe expand this idea of the everyday and the ordinary, or has your attention gone to another possible subject for the future? I mean, I'm not sure if you're starting a new project. I mean, you just published this, but I'm curious where you see yourself going.
I'm kind of interested in two different areas, or three, in some ways, three different things. I've been really thinking about the Stoics a great deal. And intellectually, that comes from a lot of reading of Pierre Hadot in writing about the ordinary and thinking about philosophy as a way of life rather than just a discourse, rather than something that you just, pick up and put down when you have to do something, but it is really a trying to live the examined life. Mm-hmm. And so that's been something that I really want, and really just feeling like at this moment, in the face of, say, the internet and capitalism and its focus on pleasure seeking and immediate gratification, and where that seemingly has gotten us, and general frustration with anti-intellectualism, the Stoics are an interesting response to that. And to me, it's a natural progression. But I'm also really wanting to think more about photography. That's something that I'm really thinking that might be at the center of whatever the next project is. I don't want to think, and I'm not interested in thinking about photography as merely document or photography in light of truth or non-truth, but photography as an aesthetic experience that can tell us something about representing the world. I know that's a little vague, but it's something that I, want to think about, how the presentation of something has a call upon us, and what we're doing when people are making photographs, and what we're doing when we're looking at them. And like I said, not just any photographs, but aesthetic ones, artistic photographs, and, what that might have to say about ideas of truth.
That sounds really interesting, especially I could see, well, I don't know if it depends where you go with it, but I could see sort of the need to update philosophically some of the work that's been done on photography. I mean, I love Roland Barthes, and a number of Pierre Bourdieu writes about photography, but I haven't seen anything really in terms of the 21st century and all the digital photographs that are floating around. It would be really interesting to see what you think about that.
Yeah, me too. I'll be interested to see.
But yeah, I mean, Richard, I've taken up a lot of your time, and I really appreciate you talking to me about your book. I want to just thank you for talking to me today.
Well, Chris, I really appreciate this. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Again, I just want to thank everyone who's listened and who's supported the podcast, either by leaving a review or checking out the website, buying some books from the website's links, or ordering some stickers, which is always appreciated, as I mentioned earlier. I will say, it's kind of funny, I was recording this and I didn't really notice in the background there was a sort of noise. I don't know if the listener, you, or perhaps somebody in your house noticed this. Anyway, I was recording this one last time, the intro and the exit, and I noticed my dogs were really going nuts. I don't know why. I have 4 little dogs. Sometimes I bring them to the office where I do the final post edits, and they were really going nuts. What I realized is that there's Richard's cat in the background, I think multiple cats, making noises. While I didn't necessarily notice it when I was speaking to him, I guess I was so engaged, I did notice that for a little while there are these meows that maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't, but that's sort of a little tidbit I'd throw out for people who are listening to the end. Maybe if you want to go back and try to find those, or maybe you already heard them and you're smarter, you have better hearing than I do. It was kind of funny because I didn't understand what was happening. I thought they really, for some reason, didn't like Richard's book, but it's definitely not that. Thank you again for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Cheers.